Complex numbers. So in this video, I'm going to talk about operations with complex numbers. I'm going to identify the different components of complex numbers and show you a relationship between I and I squared and I cubed, and how we can find values to be able to sub imaginary numbers into equations that we are more familiar with. In the first question, we're asked to solve for a square root. This is a question that you've seen before when you want to get x by itself. In order to solve, we take the plus or minus square root of each side. And when we simplify this, we get positive and negative 8. Now the reason why we get two different values is that when we sub in positive 8, that does equal 16. And when we sub in negative 8, because we're squaring it, that equals positive 16 as well. Now where we're moving to is if we get a question where we have a negative on the other side. In the past, we've said that we haven't been able to actually solve this question. But today, we are going to actually solve it using imaginary numbers. So we approach the exact same way. We take the square root, plus or minus, of both sides. So x is by itself on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we get plus or minus the square root of negative 16. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to separate the 16 from the negative. If you remember your radical rules, when we have two radicals, you can multiply the negative 1 and the 16 to get negative 16. So that means that you can also expand it as well. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I can actually take the square root of 16. So I can simplify that. And what I've done is I've isolated the square root of negative 1. And the reason I've done that is because our imaginary component is actually equivalent to the square root of negative 1. So in the past, we've said we haven't been able to actually simplify this, but now we can do it as long as we're using our imaginary term. So our imaginary unit is I, and it's equivalent to the square root of negative 1. If we have I is equal to the square root of negative 1, we can actually solve for I squared as well. And that's something we're going to use later on when we start multiplying and dividing our complex numbers. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But the one thing I want to outline for you is, what is a complex number? Our complex number is a plus b I, and it has two components to it. It has a real component and it has an imaginary component. The part that has the I is the imaginary component, and we can do operations with these numbers as long as we're collecting like terms, meaning that we're adding and subtracting the reals together and we're adding and subtracting the imaginaries together.